Attica wasn't just a prison, it was a pressure cooker waiting to explode. In 1971, that explosion became the deadliest prison uprising in U.S. history, an event so brutal, so politically charged, that Attica never truly recovered. What happened behind those walls shocked the world, and the truth is even darker than the headlines. Before we step inside Attica's gates, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the prison that changed America forever. Attica Correctional Facility stands on a quiet stretch of land in western New York, surrounded by farm fields, long roads, and silence so deep it almost feels intentional, as if the isolation itself is part of the punishment. When it opened in 1931, Attica wasn't built to rehabilitate. It wasn't built to reform. It was built to contain, to control, and to remind every man who entered through its iron gates that the state owned his body, his time, and sometimes even his hope. From the very beginning, the architecture was a statement of power. Massive grey walls, 2 feet thick. Guard towers rising above the yard like watchful predators. Barbed wire that didn't simply deter escape, but conveyed a message: you don't run from Attica. You survive it. Or at least, you try. By the late 1960s, the population inside those walls grew far beyond capacity. Designed for roughly 1,600 men, Attica now held over 2,200, most of them Black and Latino, coming from New York City neighborhoods that felt like a different planet compared to the rural, overwhelmingly white town of Attica. The cultural collision inside the prison was immediate and relentless. The inmates complained constantly, but complaints is too soft a word. These were warnings, signals that something violent was being born in the dark corners of Attica. Food was spoiled, portions were tiny, and sickness spread as quickly as rumors. Showers were controlled by the officers, who turned the water cold in the winter and scorching hot in the summer, just because they could. Mail was censored. Medical care was a joke. Aspirin was the cure for everything, even broken bones. And worst of all, racial tension was a living, breathing force. Nearly 70% of the inmate population were men of color. Nearly 100% of the guards were white. Many of them had never interacted with men outside their own race before taking the job. To them, Attica wasn't just a workplace, it was a battleground, and they treated inmates like an enemy force. Inside the cell blocks, the air was thick with distrust. Not just between guards and inmates, but inmate against inmate, block against block, city guys against country guys, Muslims against Christians, young men against old convicts who had already given up. Everyone felt watched, judged, and provoked. But underneath all that division was a shared frustration, a single boiling point that connected all 2,200 men. They were treated as less than human. Prisoners were allowed only 1 shower per week. 1 roll of toilet paper per month. 1 bar of soap that had to last nearly a month. And they worked for almost no pay, 6 to 29 cents an hour on average. Inmates began reading books on political awareness, civil rights, and prison reform. George Jackson's writings circulated through the tiers like forbidden treasure. Malcolm X's speeches were copied by hand. The men began to understand their value, their collective power, and their right to resist. The guards noticed. The administration noticed. And instead of addressing the concerns, they tightened control. Yard time was reduced. Privileges were taken away. Punishments became harsher. What the state failed to understand was simple. When people feel they have nothing left to lose, they stop playing by the rules. By the summer of 1971, the tension was so heavy that even the guards whispered about an event on the horizon, something big, something violent. They didn't know when it would come, but everyone knew it was coming. The atmosphere inside Attica felt like a dormant volcano. Hot, silent, and ready to erupt. Inmates noticed small changes too: doors sticking, guards moving in tighter formations, strange orders coming from the administration. Somewhere deep in the prison, rumors whispered that officials were preparing for an uprising. But no one, neither guards nor inmates, knew that in just a few weeks, Attica would explode into the deadliest prison rebellion in American history. One that would scar the institution forever. One that Attica would never recover from. Dawn broke slowly over Attica on September 9, 1971. As the sun pushed faint beams of light across the grey walls, nothing appeared unusual from the outside. But inside the cell blocks, a storm was gathering, one built on decades of abuse, neglect, and silent rage. The morning began like every other, metal clanging, boots stomping on concrete, doors slamming open, and the harsh echo of guards barking orders. At 7:40 a.m., prisoners from cell block A and C marched toward the metal gates for their daily work assignments. The line moved stiffly, guarded on both sides by officers holding batons, eyes scanning for the slightest excuse to lash out. But the men in that line were not just tired. They were not just frustrated. They were simmering. Everything started with something small, something that would have seemed insignificant on any other day. A guard confronted two inmates over a simple misunderstanding, an argument about whether they were allowed to move down the corridor. Voices rose. Other prisoners stopped walking. A crowd began to form. In Attica, crowds meant danger. The officers tried to break it up. Then someone pushed. No one knows who pushed first, stories differ, memories blur, but the effect was instant. The tension that had been building for months ignited in a single spark. A guard swung his baton. An inmate retaliated. Another prisoner shouted. A shove turned into a fight. A fight turned into an eruption. Within seconds, the corridor was chaos, bodies colliding, boots pounding, metal clashing against flesh. Guards called for backup. More inmates joined in. The sound was deafening, roars, screams, and the echo of violence bouncing through the steel hallways. Someone, no one will ever know exactly who, smashed the gate controls. The lock jammed. The heavy metal door swung loose. And suddenly the inmates had access to areas they had never been allowed to reach. That was the moment Attica lost control. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of prisoners overpowered guards, seized batons, grabbed makeshift weapons, and forced their way into the central prison yard D-yard, the largest open space in the entire facility. What began as a scuffle exploded into a full-scale rebellion. The guards trapped inside were quickly overwhelmed. Some were beaten, some were dragged, some were carried away as hostages, alive, terrified, and helpless. From the guard towers above, officers sounded the alarm. Sirens wailed across the prison grounds. The town of Attica heard the noise and froze. Residents looked out their windows, hearts sinking. Everyone in Attica feared this day. Everyone knew what the alarms meant. Inside the yard, the prisoners realized something alarming. They had taken Attica. Not part of it. Not a wing or a hallway. They held control of D-yard, the heart of the prison, and with it, leverage no inmate in modern U.S. history had ever possessed: hostages. Men poured out of the cell blocks, some screaming, some praying, some stunned at the sudden shift in power. A few raised their fists in the air, shouting words they'd never dared speak before. Others carried injured guards to a corner of the yard, terrified that killing a hostage would bring immediate slaughter. The outbreak wasn't about murder, it was about desperation. Amid the chaos, leaders emerged. Older inmates who had long advocated for prisoner rights. Young men with voices powerful enough to rally crowds. Members of political and religious groups who had been quietly organizing discussions for months. They shouted for calm. They demanded order. And somehow, unbelievably, the yard began to settle. Within an hour, the prisoners transformed the chaos into structure. They formed security teams. They created medical stations using ripped shirts as bandages and broken boards as stretchers. They protected the hostages, not out of kindness, but because they understood the truth. Hostages were the only thing keeping the state from storming the prison and killing everyone. Over 1,200 inmates gathered in the yard, staring up at the armed guards in the towers, men who now hesitated to fire because they could not tell inmate from hostage. The balance of power had reversed. Meanwhile, New York State officials received the first reports. Attica is in full rebellion. Phones rang throughout Albany. Politicians scrambled. The governor's office demanded answers. No one had expected this scale of uprising, not in New York, not in a prison considered one of the most secure in the nation. By midday, smoke rose from parts of the facility. Prisoners broke into the infirmary to get medicine. Others took over the kitchens and distributed food. A few set fires to block guard movement in specific corridors. But contrary to the media's early narratives, the rebellion wasn't pure chaos. It wasn't a mindless riot. Inside the yard, the inmates formed a council. A leadership group. A voice. They wanted healthcare. They wanted better food, fair visitation, religious freedom, and an end to the beatings. They wanted to be treated like men, not animals. For the first time in Attica's history, the inmates felt something they had been denied for decades. Hope. But outside those walls, the state was preparing for something very different. Troopers gathered in full force. Helicopters hovered overhead. Politicians debated whether to negotiate or retake the prison by force. What no one inside Attica knew, not the inmates, not the hostages, not even the guards in the towers, was that political decisions made over the next 4 days would turn this uprising into a tragedy so devastating, so irreversible, that Attica Correctional Facility would never fully heal. This was only the beginning. The darkest days were still ahead. When the smoke cleared on the first afternoon of the Attica uprising, the prison looked like a battlefield frozen in time. Guards stood trembling in the towers, rifles aimed downward but fingers hesitant. In the center of D Yard, over 1,000 inmates formed a moving, murmuring mass, some pacing with adrenaline, some sitting in prayer circles, others standing guard near the hostages who were now blindfolded and seated along a makeshift barrier. The yard had become a strange, contradictory world. Violence had sparked the rebellion, but what followed was a desperate fight against violence. Inmates knew one wrong move, one hostage harmed, one guard killed, would bring a massacre. Many had seen what state troopers had done at Attica in the past. A full assault would be the end of everything. As night approached, tension wound around the prison like a tightening rope. Floodlights shot long white beams over the yard, illuminating the inmates in cold, harsh light. Every man looked like a target. Every shadow looked like a threat. And then came the voice. A prisoner named L.D. Barkley, young, charismatic, and deeply respected, stepped onto a platform made of overturned mattresses and wooden crates. His voice boomed through the yard, bouncing off concrete and steel. "We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such." The crowd roared. Men raised fists. Some cried. The guards in the towers listened in stunned silence. Barkley wasn't calling for bloodshed. He was calling for dignity. He spoke not as a criminal, but as a representative of 1,200 human beings who had endured decades of suffering. For the first time since the rebellion began, inmates felt their message taking shape. During the early morning hours of September 10th, the prisoners compiled a list of demands they believed were the difference between life and death. Better medical care, adequate food, religious freedom, access to education, an end to physical abuse, fair visitation rights, a realistic wage for prison work. But the most controversial demand of all was simple and terrifying. Amnesty. A guarantee that no inmate would be punished for participating in the uprising. Without that, they believed surrender was suicide. By sunrise, negotiators arrived at the prison, civil rights attorney William Kunstler, state assemblyman Arthur Eve, and a panel of observers known as the Attica Liberation Faction. They were escorted through the metal gates in armored vehicles and brought to a thin, heavily protected corridor separating the inmates from the authorities. The space became known as the Dead Zone, a narrow no-man's land filled with fear, tension, and the echo of desperate voices. From the yard side of the fence, prisoners shouted their demands. From the law enforcement side, officials consulted, whispered, strategized. In the middle stood the negotiators, trying to bridge a gap between two worlds that had been at war long before the riot. When the observers entered D Yard for the first time, they were shocked. Despite the chaos, the prisoners had organized themselves with unbelievable discipline. Medical teams treated wounded hostages and inmates alike. Leaders patrolled the yard to prevent retaliation. Food was distributed. Even the hostages were protected from angry mobs by prisoner security squads. One observer said later, "It was the most tragic, yet the most hopeful, scene I had ever walked into." Negotiations began with optimism. Guards and officials listened. The commissioner nodded. Inmates felt heard, maybe for the first time in decades. But outside the prison walls, a different story was taking shape. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller monitored the situation from Albany, refusing to set foot anywhere near Attica. Politically, he had everything to lose. An election loomed. Appearing sympathetic to prisoners could destroy him. To Rockefeller, negotiation wasn't a solution. It was a sign of weakness. As talks progressed inside the yard, state police outside prepared for war. Troopers in riot gear marched across the grounds. Helicopters hovered low. Snipers positioned themselves on rooftops and water towers. The longer the negotiations dragged on, the more restless and impatient the state became. Inside the prison, the inmates sensed the shift. Barclay and other leaders gathered under a cluster of spotlights and read the state's responses to their demands. Some requests were accepted. Others ignored. And the most important amnesty was flatly denied. A cold silence spread through the yard. Without amnesty, any surrender was a death sentence. Men whispered to each other, wondering if they should keep fighting, or if the state was preparing to kill them all. Arguments broke out. Voices rose. Fear spread like a deadly illness. By the second night of the rebellion, the dead zone had become a graveyard of hope. Negotiators pleaded for more time. The state gave them less. Guards' families gathered outside the walls, begging for their loved ones to be rescued. Reporters flooded the town. Cameras blazed. The entire nation watched the standoff unfold like a drama written in fire. Inside D Yard, one inmate said quietly, "We are already dead. We are just waiting to see how they bury us." Meanwhile, on the other side of the wall, Governor Rockefeller made a private decision. A decision that would change the course of American prison history forever. He ordered preparations for a military assault. No more negotiation. No more compromise. No more listening. The state would retake Attica by force. The inmates didn't know it yet. The hostages didn't know it yet. The nation didn't know it yet. But Attica was about to descend into one of the most violent and tragic confrontations the United States had ever witnessed. The countdown to bloodshed had begun. Just before dawn on September 13, 1971, Attica Correctional Facility was unnervingly quiet. The floodlights flickered across the yard, illuminating the exhausted, hollow-eyed faces of prisoners who had barely slept in 4 days. Some sat huddled in blankets. Others stood guard near the hostages, who were tied, blindfolded, and trembling. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The air was thick with dread. There was a strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. Then came the sound. A low, distant rumble. The earth vibrated. Metal clashed. Boots thundered. The inmates rose to their feet, turning their eyes toward the massive metal gates. A cloud of dust began to form in the early morning light. Something was coming. Something unstoppable. Something deadly. Seconds later, they saw it. An army, hundreds of heavily armed state troopers and correctional officers marching toward the yard in full riot gear. Shotguns in hand. Rifles slung across their chests. Gas masks covering their faces, making them look like faceless executioners. The prisoners froze. This wasn't negotiation. This wasn't rescue. This was war. In the command center, Governor Rockefeller had given a single, chilling directive. Retake the prison. No matter the cost. At 9:46 a.m., a helicopter roared overhead. The sound was deafening. The crowd in D Yard looked up as the aircraft hovered above them, its rotors slicing the air like a mechanical predator. Then canisters dropped. A white cloud exploded over the yard, tear gas, thick and choking, swallowing the prisoners and hostages alike in a blinding haze. Men screamed, coughing violently, stumbling as their eyes burned. The hostages, already bound and helpless, thrashed in panic as the gas smothered them. And then the shooting started. Not rubber bullets. Not warning shots. Live rounds. The moment the gas dropped, troopers opened fire. From the catwalks. From the towers. From the ground. Hundreds of bullets raining down into the yard. Some inmates ran, arms over their heads, pleading for mercy. Others dropped to the ground, trying to shield the hostages with their bodies. Some attempted to push the hostages toward safer areas, desperate to prevent the slaughter everyone knew was coming. It didn't matter. The troopers fired at anything that moved. They fired at men with no weapons. They fired at men running away. They fired at men already on the ground. They fired at hostages, some by mistake, some because in the gas and haze, no one could see who was who. The assault lasted just 15 minutes. 15 minutes that would scar American history forever. When the shooting stopped, the silence was worse than the gunfire. Bodies lay twisted in the mud. Some were piled on each other. Some were barely alive, twitching. Many were already dead. Blood soaked the yard in long, dark streaks. Troopers stormed in through the gates, screaming orders, beating prisoners with batons, dragging wounded men by their shirts, boots, or hair. Anyone who moved was hit. Anyone who didn't move was kicked until they did. A group of troopers approached a cluster of inmates huddled in fear. One officer yelled, "Face down." Another shouted, "Don't move." And then a third screamed something that would later be reported in federal investigations. "You animals. We're gonna kill every one of you." In the chaos, some inmates were singled out for special punishment. Men believed to be leaders were forced to crawl naked through broken glass. Others were made to lie in the yard while guards beat them repeatedly with nightsticks, rifle butts, and boots. Meanwhile, the hostages lay bleeding on the ground. Many were dead. Others were dying. Some were groaning for help that would arrive too late. The tragedy was incomprehensible. When troopers finally secured the yard, medics rushed in. But their first priority wasn't inmates, it was guards. Even then, the truth became clear almost immediately. Most of the hostages had been killed by gunfire. State gunfire. Not knives. Not beatings. Not inmate weapons. Bullets. In the aftermath, officials attempted to conceal this. Early statements falsely claimed the hostages had their throats slit by prisoners. The narrative painted inmates as brutal murderers. Newspapers ran headlines blaming the uprising for the deaths. But the autopsies told the truth. No slit throats. No stab wounds. No torture. Every hostage killed during the assault died from trooper bullets. It was one of the largest massacres in a U.S. prison. And it was orchestrated by the state itself. As the smoke cleared, the reality settled like a shroud over the yard. The rebellion was over. The inmates were defeated. The hostages were gone. The troopers stood victorious in posture but shaken in soul. And Attica Correctional Facility was left with a stain that would never wash away. The assault lasted just 15 minutes. But those 15 minutes destroyed hundreds of lives. And changed the future of American corrections forever. When the gunfire stopped and the smoke thinned into a pale gray haze, the yard at Attica looked like a war zone left behind by a storm of bullets. Bodies lay scattered across the mud, nearly every one of them face down, arms twisted unnaturally, hands clenched in final reflexes of fear. Troopers walked among them like soldiers surveying conquered territory, rifles still raised, adrenaline still burning. But even as medical staff rushed in, even as cameras rolled just outside the gates, and even as the public waited for answers, something unsettling began to unfold, quietly, deliberately, and in full view of the men who knew the truth. The cover-up started almost immediately. Officials needed a story. A clean one. A simple one. One that made the state appear justified, heroic, and necessary. And they needed it fast. Before the medics even identified the first body, statements were already being prepared. Prison spokespersons whispered with state police commanders. Troopers exchanged hushed conversations with corrections administrators. Reporters crowded the perimeter fence, desperate for details. Minutes later, the first lie was spoken aloud. A prison official stepped forward and told the press. The hostages were killed by inmates. Their throats were slashed. The words hit like an explosion. Reporters gasped. Cameramen scrambled. News vans rushed to broadcast the claim across the country. Headlines flashed in bold letters. Hostages slain by prisoners in Attica Uprising. It was a horrifying image, prisoners cutting the throats of the very guards they had held for days. It made the troopers' assault appear justified, even merciful. It painted the inmates as savage killers. And in the heat of panic, fear, and national tension, the public believed every word. But inside the prison, the truth lay in plain sight. Some hostages were still alive, gasping, choking from gas inhalation, or bleeding from gunshot wounds, not stab wounds. Prison medics, still crying from the tear gas, attended to them. Cameras saw no cut throats, no slashes, no knife wounds. Doctors knew instantly that the official story was wrong. State troopers knew too, they had seen the bodies. Prison administrators knew, they had been told. Rockefeller's people knew, they had been briefed. Still, the lie spread with astonishing speed. Inside the yard, the surviving inmates watched officials speak to the press through the chain-link fence. They couldn't fully hear everything, but rumors dripped back into the yard like poison. They're blaming us. They're saying we killed the hostages. They're lying already. Some inmates tried to shout toward the reporters, screaming the truth, but no one listened. Their voices were drowned out by official statements, by sirens, by the sheer force of the narrative already taking shape. The public didn't want nuance. They didn't want empathy. They didn't want complexity. They wanted someone to blame, and the easiest target was the men inside those walls. As evening approached, a chilling scene unfolded in the makeshift morgue. The bodies of hostages and prisoners alike were lined up on cold concrete floors. Doctors performed autopsies under harsh lights, their faces frozen in disbelief. One doctor lifted a sheet from a guard's body. A trooper stepped forward and asked quietly, "Did they cut him?" The doctor's voice was firm. "No. This man was shot. Multiple times. Another sheet. Another gunshot wound. Another. And another." By the time they finished examining the last hostage, the truth was undeniable and irreversible. Every single hostage who died during the assault was killed by trooper bullets. Not one had been stabbed. Not one had their throat cut. Not one was killed by an inmate. Word spread quickly among the medical staff. Some were horrified. Others were furious. A few demanded that the truth be reported immediately. But the prison's administration made it clear. The story was already set. The narrative already written. And anyone who contradicted it would face consequences. Outside the walls, the media frenzy intensified. Reporters cried on camera as they described the brutal slaughter committed by prisoners. Families of the hostages screamed in agony, believing their loved ones had been tortured. Behind closed doors, though, officials scrambled. Autopsies contradicted their claims. Medical staff threatened to speak out. Negotiators pushed for transparency. Governor Rockefeller refused comment. The state police commissioner avoided reporters. Every official statement became vaguer, quieter, more defensive. Within 24 hours, the truth began to leak. A coroner stepped forward and revealed the first crack in the official story. There were no slit throats. The lie collapsed instantly. Reporters demanded answers. Politicians panicked. The state spun faster. But even as the truth emerged, the damage was done. The public already believed the first version, the false one. And in crisis, the first story is often the only one that sticks. Meanwhile, inside Attica, the inmates who had survived the assault faced a new nightmare. Troopers forced them to strip naked and lie face down in the mud for hours. Some were beaten so badly they lost teeth, suffered broken bones, or passed out from pain. Leaders of the rebellion were targeted with humiliating, brutal punishments. The message from the state was unmistakable. We will rewrite what happened. And you will accept it in silence. But the truth could not remain buried. Not with so many witnesses. Not with so many bodies. Not with so many families demanding answers. A storm was coming, a legal, political, and moral battle that would stretch for decades. And Attica, the prison that had tried to hide what happened inside its walls, would be dragged into the spotlight again and again, forced to confront the nightmare it created. In the days following the retaking of Attica, the prison didn't feel like a correctional facility anymore. It felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster, except this disaster had been deliberate, calculated, and carried out by the state. The walls still stood, the gates still locked, and the guard towers still rose into the sky, but the soul of the institution was shattered beyond recognition. Smoke still drifted through parts of the yard, the ground scarred by bullet impacts and littered with broken batons, empty gas canisters, shattered glass, and blood-soaked clothing. The sounds that echoed through the facility were not the usual clang of metal doors or the bark of guards' orders. Instead, it was the low moans of injured men, the cries of those mourning lost friends, and the heavy silence of trauma settling deep into the bones of Attica. The survivors, both inmates and guards, walked through the prison like ghosts, dazed and hollow. Everyone had lost something in those 15 minutes of hell: friends, peace, innocence, trust, humanity. And now, with the riot over, Attica entered a darker, colder phase. The punishments began almost instantly. Troopers forced inmates to crawl across the yard on their elbows and knees, dragging bleeding skin across broken glass and gravel. Some were beaten with rifle butts if they moved too slowly. Others were forced to lie naked on the freezing concrete for hours, hands on their heads, unable to speak or even look around. One prisoner later said, "I thought the riot was the worst day of my life until the riot was over." As the beatings continued, the prison administration began sorting the inmates into groups. Those suspected of leading the uprising. Those believed to have harmed guards. Those simply unlucky enough to be near the center of the chaos. Each group faced interrogations. These sessions were not dignified interviews, they were brutal, drawn-out ordeals in dimly lit rooms where officers demanded confessions, cooperation, or names. Some prisoners were so injured they couldn't stand. Others had to be carried in by fellow inmates. Rumors began swirling throughout the prison, rumors of a secret list of prisoners the state wanted to charge with murder, riot leadership, and assault. Men whispered about names being selected not based on evidence but on convenience. Inside the makeshift infirmary, conditions were equally grim. Medical staff worked around the clock treating gunshot wounds, fractures, broken jaws, and deep bruises. Supplies were scarce. Space was limited. And many of the men, overwhelmed by pain and fear, refused to talk to anyone. The hostages, those who survived, were kept apart from the inmates. Many were so traumatized they could barely speak. Some cried uncontrollably. Some were in shock. A few had no memory of the assault at all. What haunted them was not only what had happened in the yard but the knowledge that the bullets that killed their fellow guards came from the very officers sent to rescue them. Families of the hostages arrived at Attica demanding answers. What they received instead were vague official statements, rehearsed lines, and a carefully curated narrative designed to protect the state. The truth, still leaking slowly through medical reports, was too devastating for authorities to admit openly. Meanwhile, Governor Rockefeller maintained his distance. He refused to visit the prison. Refused to speak directly to the hostages' families. Refused to acknowledge the bloodbath that happened under his orders. In the town of Attica, fear turned to anger. Residents blamed the prisoners first. Then, as more truth surfaced, they began to blame the state. Law enforcement officers felt betrayed and unprotected. Prison guards, many of whom had worked at Attica for years, now looked at the institution with disgust. For decades before the riot, Attica had operated under a rigid, militarized structure. There had always been tension between guards and inmates, but the uprising and its aftermath blew those tensions wide open. The violence had not destroyed Attica's buildings, but it had obliterated its culture. Back within the walls, a new kind of silence settled. It wasn't empty. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of fear. Every inmate knew the truth. Attica would never return to the way it was before. The rebellion had changed them. The massacre had changed them. The cover-up had changed them. Group meetings were banned. Movement became more restricted. Rules multiplied. Surveillance increased. Every conversation felt risky. Every step felt watched. Inmates who once demanded rights were now too afraid to raise their voices. The guards, too, were forever altered. Many walked the blocks with an edge of paranoia. Some feared retaliation. Others harbored resentment for being thrust into a situation they never imagined. Some were broken by survivors' guilt. Everyone lived under a constant shadow. And yet, even in this darkness, something unexpected began to stir beyond the walls. News outlets, once quick to blame the inmates, started digging deeper. Civil rights groups demanded independent investigations. Lawyers filed lawsuits. The families of the hostages wanted answers the state refused to give. Medical examiners leaked autopsy findings. Public pressure mounted. Protests erupted. Documentaries were proposed. Congress began asking questions. Attica could no longer hide. The truth was emerging, slowly but relentlessly. And as it did, the United States was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Attica wasn't a single tragedy. It wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a broken prison system, one that would soon be exposed to the world. The struggle for justice was just beginning. The legacy of Attica did not fade with time. It calcified. The silence inside those walls grew heavier, the corridors colder, the memories sharper. Every guard who walked the tiers carried the weight of September 1971 like a second uniform strapped to their back. Every inmate who entered the facility knew, before their first meal, that they were stepping into a prison carved by blood and rebuilt by fear. Attica never truly healed because it was never truly allowed to. The state inquiries, press conferences, and official reports might have closed their binders, but the ghosts roaming the cell blocks were never filed away. Even decades later, visitors described a tension so thick it felt like the air pushed back when they breathed. Lockdowns happened faster, punishment came harsher, and trust between staff and inmates was a concept that simply could not survive in the soil Attica was built on. For many of the men who lived behind those bars, Attica wasn't a correctional facility, it was a scar wearing a badge. They spoke of nights filled with distant screams, of guards who patrolled with haunted eyes, of floors where the blood from the uprising had soaked so deep into the concrete that no amount of scrubbing could convince anyone it was ever truly gone. And beyond the razor wire, the world kept watching. Activists, journalists, and historians visited Attica like pilgrims visiting a battlefield. Some sought answers. Others sought justice. Most left with more questions than they arrived with. Decades after the riot, the prison still carried the tension of a ticking bomb, one that had already exploded once, and whose aftershocks continued to ripple through American history. Every debate on prison reform, every documentary on mass incarceration, every rally about inmate rights. Attica's name appeared like a warning stamped across time. This is what happens when pressure is ignored. Yet for all the tragedy, Attica also became a symbol raw, painful, but undeniably powerful. A symbol of resistance. A symbol of the consequences of neglect. A symbol of the human cost of systems allowed to rot from within. In the end, Attica wasn't just a riot. It was a rupture, one that split open the truth about American prisons and exposed it to the world. And as long as those walls stand, the story will stand with them, stark, unhealed, unforgettable. Because Attica never recovered. And maybe, it was never meant to.